Hello, everyone. We are going to get started. I just want to welcome you all to Quizbowl's interorganizational panel on diversity, inclusion, and racism. Thank you for joining us today or for watching in your own time. Racism in Quizbowl is a problem that prevents teammates and community members from fully and peacefully engaging in the activity we all love. And I hope that this panel will be one step towards coming together to improve our community. I'm so excited that we have the opportunity to listen to and learn from our panelists today, and I hope that each of us viewers will leave this panel with new ideas and more resolve to make our teams and our social circles more accessible to everyone. There are several ways to continue engagement after this event. You can be on the lookout for emails from us. You can send us feedback via the form that we have set up for question submission, or you can join the new hashtag panel discussion channel in the main Quizbowl Discord. Links to the latter two are down in the chat. And just so you know, the panel discussion channel is not immediately visible when you join the Discord. So if you don't see it, or if you need permission to join it, you can post in the hashtag Quizbowl channel, or you can DM Olivia M, just Olivia and the letter M in that server, Olivia hashtag 3107 also. I will be leaving the introductions of the panelists to the guest of honor themselves, but now I do want to thank all of my co-organizers for working with me to bring this to life over the last few months. I, Athena Kern, and Moses Kitakule represented PACE in this effort. ACF was represented by Carolyn Mao and Olivia Murton. We also owe Olivia enormous gratitude for taking on many logistic duties in organizing this panel. International academic competitions was represented in organization efforts by Arthur Ramsay, who helped us greatly with all technological aspects. NAQT was represented by Seth Teitler and Jeff Hoppus. And I would also like to deeply thank all of the listed organizations for their generous financial support of this event. And finally, I will introduce our incredible moderator. Jeremy Nelson is a graduate of Alcorn State University and the University of Illinois. For the past decade, he's been a volunteer for various Quizbowl organizations, including NAQT, National History Bee, and the Conda Campus All-Star Challenge. Jeremy also serves on the diversity and inclusion team at the Exelon Corporation. So without further ado, please give a round of applause for our amazing panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Athena. Welcome, everybody, to what I feel is going to be a very important, very fruitful discussion. And hopefully you'll take some things from what you hear today. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce today's panel. I'll go around the room and let each one of them introduce themselves, let you know a little bit about them and their background in Quizbowl. And why don't we start with you, Grace?
All right. Age before beauty, I suppose. So I am a graduate. Hi, I'm Grace. I'm so glad to see such a great turnout today. I've been in the Quizbowl community for a long time. I started playing back in 2009 as a high schooler at a high technology high school in New Jersey. I went to college and played there at Yale University, where I was captain for 1 year. And finally, after a hiatus, as you know, the whole Quizbowl life cycle, of course, which means you join, you quit, you come back. I finally started playing again at MIT in the last year, and I'm so glad that this panel has come together. I can't wait to share with you all that we've talked about and all that we've been thinking about.
Thanks, Grace. Let's move on to Caroline.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline. I first started playing Quizbowl back in high school in 2016 at the American International School of Guangzhou, which is in China. I graduated and now I go to Barnard College, Columbia, where I sometimes play for Columbia, and I also do a bunch of writing/editing and the current communications officer for ACF.
Thanks, Caroline. We'll move on to Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Wright. I'm a senior at Gallatin High School, and I've been playing Quizbowl since 7th grade in middle school.
Thanks, Chris. And last but certainly not least, Esther.
Hello, everyone. I hope your day is going well. My name is Esther, and I go to Valencia College, and this is actually my first year playing Quizbowl. So I'm kind of like a baby Quizbowl player, but I did play something like this in high school for all 4 years. And I'm extremely excited for this panel and also for the amazing after discussion. So I'm exuberated.
Thank you so much, Esther, and as are all of us, I think. Before we go any further, to all of you who are watching now, you can join the conversation yourselves by asking questions through the Zoom feature on the chat here. We've got some questions that have come through the question box in the past few weeks, and we'll be answering some of those. But if you have questions that you come up with while we're having today's discussion, feel free to use that question box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as time permits. So with that, why don't we start with the discussion? So we are going to start with talking a little bit about background in feeling not so included in Quizbowl. And so in what way is the atmosphere of Quizbowl to you, or has it been alienating? And how early on was your first experience where you felt uncomfortable? Chris, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, my first experience in Quizbowl that was uncomfortable for me was my first tournament. My first practices, they were really inclusive because I was around my friends who I had known for years, and it was a different environment. But whenever I got to my first tournament, that's when I realized that I was an other, and when I started to take in the bigger picture.
Thanks, Chris. Grace?
My first uncomfortable Quizbowl experience came relatively late. I was in my senior year of high school. At that point, I'd played for a couple of years, going from the very fringes of the circuit to something closer to at least a figure of quote unquote regional importance. And in my senior year, I was asked to prom by two separate people on teams that at other schools. They'd never actually spoken to me before. And it was weird. It was obviously just a super weird situation, but it was probably my first awareness of myself as a physical entity, I think, in Quizbowl, carrying all my own qualities other than, say, my knowledge of the 30 Years' War, or like my ability to power intermittently certain art questions. And so I really brought home to me that I was a physical entity with qualities that were, and how that people would respond to, that were completely outside of my own control. Plus, it was awkward and embarrassing. And if you've ever been a high schooler, you dread awkwardness and you dread embarrassing, even though your whole life sort of seems like a mess of awkward and embarrassing. So I basically dreaded seeing either of those teams for the rest of the year. And I felt so much singled out, not for my ability to play Quizbowl, but for something totally, irrelevant.
Thanks, Grace. How about you, Caroline?
Yeah, for me, it was also relatively early on, like Chris, but it was more of a gradual thing, I think. Where at my first few practices, I felt mostly comfortable, but then I noticed that other women players tended to drop off as the practices went on, and then you're a few weeks in, and then I noticed I was the only one in the room.
And Esther, how about you?
So for me, my first uncomfortable experience was actually my first practice. This was when I played in high school in something similar to Quizbowl. And in the practice, I could definitely feel like there was a rift between me and the other players. And it was partially because I was new. Of course, I was still trying to grasp everything, but also being the only person of color in the room when questions were asked. And if I let's say did buzz in on that practice, it was kind of they were surprised that I knew anything. And it wasn't because I was new, because I could tell that they didn't really, I guess, treat other players that were new as well, because it was a group of us that joined. And I would say from then on out, that kind of shaped how it is that I came to terms with my interactions in Quizbowl.
Well, thank you, Esther. And let's take that thought and just go off on a quick tangent here. Just by show of hands, does anybody here feel boxed in by teammates as far as having to learn a specific subject that your teammates might just assume that you know more about? They assume you know more about Black history. They assume you know more about women's history, that sort of thing. Hands up. Oh, 4 for 4. Okay. Caroline, can you talk a little bit about that, about just how you felt possibly boxed in by other teammates and just those assumptions that are made?
Yeah, I don't feel like that currently, but I know I felt like that a lot in high school, that in particular, there was assumption that I didn't know STEM subjects because of who I was. And so I was mostly confined to literature and fine arts. And I think I also felt more comfortable with that because it has a very low barrier to entry in terms of being able to learn it and start scoring points compared to science. And I felt like I had that need to prove myself.
Thanks, Caroline. Why don't we move on to our next question here? So one of the things that typically we do as marginalized players, sometimes we put extra pressure on ourselves, either consciously or unconsciously. Maybe it's we feel like we have to score more, or maybe we have to mentor other people on the team that might be feeling the same way that we do when we're in practices or at tournaments. In what ways do you experience that extra pressure? And I'll start with Grace on this one.
I think that almost everyone here has experienced the pressure to perform, to prove yourself, even to your own team, or even to show your own value, I suppose, to yourself. And I think this is where questionable behaviors actually start to seep in. I think that this is one of the reasons that players of color sometimes begin to prioritize Quizbowl studying in ways that aren't enjoyable, or that can be self-sabotaging for other things in their lives. They begin to, in order to prove themselves in Quizbowl, I think they sometimes put other important aspects of their life on the back burner, and that can be pretty damaging. I also think that, especially because we often start playing Quizbowl at what can be treated as, I guess, a liminal time, especially as we're moving towards the end of high school or as we're moving into college for the first time. You're at a point where you're really hungry for notice and you're hungry for approval. You're hungry for someone to say, yes, you are valuable, you are contributing. And that's a moment at which I think you become more, it also makes you more vulnerable to the power dynamics of someone who can offer you approval. And it amplifies the power dynamics that I think are otherwise at play in Quizbowl as well.
Thanks, Grace. I'll go over to Esther. I saw you shaking your head a little bit on that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Grace said. And I just want to highlight like what she said, like when typically players, when they start playing, they're in their formative years and you're just really trying to find like your niche and where you belong, and you really want the acceptance of others. So when you're in like an environment as Quizbowl, you kind of push yourself and to like study harder and like get more questions and score more points, because you feel like in return like your teammates or just other people will respect you and you'll be deemed like as valuable. And that can have take a huge toll on your mental psyche. I know that for me, when I was playing in high school, there would be times where I would study for Quizbowl first for hours instead of like studying and doing my actual homework, because I just really wanted to like improve and get better. And just so like when I go to the tournament and like everybody's like, oh wow, like she's really good, and I was just seeking like for that validation. And I feel like that happens to everyone, but especially when you're like when you're a marginalized individual, it kind of also feels like you have to represent your group. So if you're the only girl on the team, you have to show that, oh yeah, girls are smart, they can play Quizbowl too. So I feel like that like ties into each other, and it amplifies a lot of the things that players face in Quizbowl.
Thanks. Anybody else want to add on to that? Okay. All right, then we will move on. Let me just ask a quick question here, because we did talk a little bit about how, there's a pressure there to, to be as good as you possibly can, to, be a high scorer. Knowing what you know now, with all your experience in Quizbowl, does anybody here feel as if you had gotten a higher points per game, if you were maybe your team's top scorer, that maybe you would have gotten a little more clout out of it? Or do you think that knowing what you know now, that never would have been the case?
So,
And go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was
Go
gonna
ahead. No,
say,
you're fine.
for me, definitely, because when I played in high school for the span of 4 years, after I would say my junior year, you definitely get like a lot more respect because you're known. Like people know that like when they're gonna play that team, they're like, oh, these are like the players we kind of need to look out for. So you definitely do get some respect from it once you score more points. I'm not gonna lie, but I would say that I was still treated the same, like socially. So what I had practiced, and the same microaggressions will still occur, even though I like scored more points. So I would definitely say like when it comes to like playing a match, like there is like a certain respect that you are given, because they know that you're gonna go out there and you're you're gonna do great. But when you're studying and when you're spending like, let's say, the other 80% of time that you spend in Quizbowl practicing, it still feels the same.
Yeah, I would like to add on to what Esther said. Um, I I played in high school, in college. I with two, in terms of playing skill, two of the all-time greats in the game. And the one year I was captain, I was not the top scorer on my team. And clearly I had a younger teammate who was a real up and comer. And when other teams want to reach out to collaborate to write sets, for example, or if they wanted to schedule a tournament for the whole Northeast region, even though I was at least nominally the captain, usually the point of contact was my younger teammate. And it's true that he was more visible on the forums. He was more visible also in terms of just the Quizbowl community. But it did feel somewhat alienating to be first shifted towards logistics where, I thought at least I could contribute in that sense, but then still to not really receive, I think to not really feel like I had the authority or even the capability to run a team by myself when most people look to my higher scoring younger male teammate as an authority instead.
And actually, we can segue into, you kind of gave me my segue into the next subject. I wanted to talk a little bit about, leadership positions in Quizbowl. Often, it's not often that you see people of color in leadership positions, whether it's as the captain of the team. There aren't a ton of coaches of color. But as you all have been in leadership positions or earned your leadership positions, do you ever feel as if your voice didn't hold weight because of maybe some preconceived notions about you or just some assumptions based on either your skin color or your gender?
Yeah, so for me, I often felt like leadership for me didn't necessarily mean authority, but it did mean responsibility, whereas it felt for other people, Grace in your face, it felt like the opposite for them, where they could have like all the authority and power they wanted and people would listen to them, but they didn't necessarily have to like have as much responsibility or workload. And especially like emotionally as a leader, it felt to me like I was often expected to like be calmer and like perform emotional labor and keep my team together and make sure that they were like okay, whereas like other people like especially men in similar positions who are also like they could just be like high scoring and worry about themselves, but they didn't necessarily have to worry about others.
And I'll go to Chris.
Yeah, as a captain this year of my team, I definitely feel like I have taken on more responsibility than previous captains, and that I've had higher expectations. I've had to put in a lot more work to be captain, whereas previous captains have gotten the title of being captain without all the responsibility and the work that I've had to go through.
It's very important to know. Let's go to Esther. Do you feel the same way?
I absolutely do. And just to add to the conversation, for me personally, I felt like because I became captain like my junior year of high school, the team that I was on. And even though like captains in the past, like they can kind of have whatever leadership style that they want, it seemed like for me, I had to adopt a certain leadership style in order for people to respect me. So typically for me, I'm like more of a softer player per se. But when I was captain, if we're practicing, I'm like, oh, like this isn't correct. Or if I'm explaining something, people wouldn't listen to me unless I was more mean or more strict. Then it's like, then I earned their trust and I was able to lead them. But captains in the past, they could just sit there and play and explain a few in there and like handle a few forms and that was it for them. But it was like I had to control like everyone's emotions and behaviors, and I also had to like play well, and I also had to like handle the logistics of everything. So it was definitely a lot more challenging and more demanding. Sorry.
No, you're totally fine, and thank you for that. Let's move on to the next question here. We talked a little bit about your personal experiences, and we'll continue to weave those in throughout these next few questions here. But now we're going to go to just sort of some broader topics here as it relates, to race and inclusion. I'm sure many of you have been to tournaments where over the years you've seen sort of the same teams coming every year, and you know that there's a number of high schools in the area that could potentially be Quizbowl schools, but either aren't reached out to or just don't come. What are some of the barriers that you see to entry for new players of color? And I'll start with Grace on this one.
I think that there are both structural and personal factors at play here, right? In terms of the structural ones, I think, as you said, very often we do look to the usual suspects when we invite teams to tournaments. We look for enough teams to fill out our tournament fields so that the club has enough funding for the next year or to attend our own tournaments, and then we call it quits there. Even when we look for outreach, we tend to look at the usual suspects. That is to say, schools that match the demographics of what we think of as quiz bowlers. So magnet schools, wealthy suburban schools, schools with high percentages of Asian and white students, schools that participate in some form of quiz show already, or local quiz league, often again matching all of the parameters we've mentioned before. One thing this summer, as we were talking about ways in which Quiz Bowl could be more anti-racist, Moses, who's on the organizing panel on behalf of PACE, and one of my favorite teammates, mentioned something that I thought was actually shocking. We had been on the Yale team together, and in all the years that we ran tournaments twice a year in New Haven, we never once had a school from New Haven proper itself. And I don't think we ever sent out invitations to New Haven schools either. It was just, it wasn't, when we thought about building a circuit, we thought about basically building a circuit that in some ways reified the biases in the populations that already play Quiz Bowl, and we didn't think bigger. I also, I guess, want to say that when you do invite, teams that don't match, the traditional Quiz Bowl demographic, you have to equip them with the skills to succeed. That is to say, you can't invite them and then expect that after getting beaten up by schools that have been attending Quiz Bowl tournaments since time immemorial, they'll be invigorated and excited to come back. I mean, if you enjoy being crushed by knowledge and that kind of, and you think that that's exciting, that's wonderful. Consider grad school, but I think the best way to actually attract new teams to Quiz Bowl is to not only invite them, but also give them the resources to succeed. So tell them where to find study materials, tell them what to expect, maybe restrict eligibility so that they're not being matched up against well-established programs. All of these things, I think, are important for building new circuits and building a new vision, I think, of what a Quiz Bowler should look like.
I'd like to go over, if possible, to Chris, because Chris, I know you had some really good insights when we started talking about these questions about outreach to schools that maybe are not part of the default that teams typically reach out to.
Yeah, I think a main barrier to entry for people of color is the lack of exposure to Quiz Bowl. And I think that could be helped by creating Quiz Bowl teams at elementary and middle school level clubs. And, I think that would make it better for them whenever they got to high school. So they would have more experience, and it wouldn't just be another club to join whenever they got to high school. It would be something that they had fostered a love for, in earlier grades.
I actually want to tag on to what Chris said. I think that having early experience in some ways reduces that barrier to entry because, again, you know what to expect early and you don't feel like you've fallen way behind. One thing that I remember feeling when I first began to play Quiz Bowl, my parents are immigrants. They certainly are not, we weren't a family that, say, got the New Yorker in the mail or talked about what was in the New York Times art section. We didn't visit museums all the time. We just weren't that kind of family. And so when I started Quiz Bowl, and especially in college, when I met some students who, when what I would think of as a really obscure book or some kind of sociological text came up, they say, "Oh, that's on my dad's bookshelf." It was, it was a little bit shocking. And I think Quiz Bowl can be a tremendous window onto the world, but especially when you're coming in from a background where these aren't really part of your day-to-day life. It can be a little alienating, the subject matter. And I think there needs to be both adequate support in terms of figuring out what Quiz Bowl asks about and choosing to make that more inclusive, and ways of getting new players really like embedded within Quizbowl's idea of the canon.
Thanks, Grace. Before we continue really quick, I see that we have a couple questions that are in the chat function and a couple of hands that are raised. Please make sure that you're putting those questions in the Q&A so that we have them all in the same place so that we're not looking in different places for questions. So thank you everybody for that. But Caroline and Esther, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, that's totally fine. Let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about what sounds really from what Grace and Chris have said, are talking about creating a ramp up or a pipeline that actually helps students start to love Quizbowl and really continue that love throughout their playing careers. But one of the things I do want to talk about is retention. We do have a number of current players of color who are currently in the Quizbowl pipeline, whether they're middle schoolers or all the way up to college by now and looking to possibly become staffers one day. What does retention look like, and how do we change the experience for people of color? And I kind of want to start with Caroline on this one because I know you have question writing experience. So maybe if you could speak a little bit to, maybe, do things need to change when it comes to question writing? Is the question writing experience one of the things that's hindering people from wanting to stick with it? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. You said stick with what?
To stick with Quizbowl. Are the questions as written now indicative of the people who are playing the game, and are they questions that would encourage a person of color who may not necessarily feel as represented by the questions to maybe want to stick with it?
Okay, yeah. I definitely think that Quizbowl still has a ways to go in terms of sufficient diversity and representation and making sure that everyone feels like their voices and their cultures matter. But I also think that the real world has a long ways to go. And I think to some extent that writers try to, reflect what's important in the real world. But I don't think that's necessarily like an excuse to not have diversity in your sets, because I think we should be trying to write toward a better world in a sense. Like we should not be writing necessarily the world as it is, but the world as it could be. A world where we encourage each other to learn about a diversity of people, where we have better representation, and through question writing, we encourage people to learn more about like people of color.
I'll go to Esther on this one.
So I completely agree with what Caroline said, and I feel like a lot of the times with the questions, like as Grace said, it feels like you're like 3 years behind, even though you may have started the same year as someone playing Quizbowl, because it's just like it feels like the questions are geared against you, and it's not things that like you would talk about. Like I would say from my background, me and my family, we didn't talk about like classical literature. So if I'm playing Quizbowl and this is like something that I want to learn more about, it's like I have to study even more and even harder just to learn something that someone probably just like had a classic conversation with their father. And it isn't like to knock people like that, but it would just be a lot more helpful if we made the questions more whole rounded and represents like what our world is, like paint the whole entire picture. So other people of color, they can hear questions that's like, oh, like I talked about this last week. So it isn't like you hear questions like that and it's like another alienation that you feel.
That's a good point. And why don't we talk a little bit about team culture? About, you spend a lot of time after school, between classes on the weekends with the people on your team. And sometimes, depending on, how the organization school by school is run, you may not necessarily feel an affinity to your team or vice versa. What can we do, or what can people do to sort of change the culture of how Quizbowl teams operate? Because I would presume that has something to do with why the pipeline breaks down. You don't necessarily have as many people of color who start Quizbowl in high school that continue through college or continue through staffing. And I'll go to Grace for that one.
So I think there are a lot of layers here. Again, I think all of these are terrific questions, but they're not that simple to break down. In terms of team culture, at least within from where many people begin in high school, One barrier to maintaining a coherent team culture is that many teams don't have coaches that are supportive and involved. So coaches, of course, there are many who are tremendous anchors on their circuit, who maintain amazing programs and also care about their students' well-being and about issues of diversity and inclusion. But I think there are also many coaches that are simply warm bodies. And in those cases, teams can be very student run, and students, again, they're a mandatory 4-year turnover. So it's hard to maintain a culture of respect. So one thing that I would like to see, and it's something that I don't think I succeeded in when I was in high school, is not only to say, train your teammates to recognize the difference between good and bad questions, or recognize this as a stock clue or a power clue, but also to think about how we treat each other respectfully. Some younger students at my school, a couple years after I graduated, basically relentlessly bullied a classmate for his sexuality. And I wish, looking back, that I had spent more time talking to those teammates about how we treat each other, what values we think are important, and less time on, oh, this is a bad question because X, Y, and Z, because that's, in the scheme of things, not that important. But Quizbowl, I think the issues of retention come down a little bit to question content, but come way more down to how we actually treat each other in the game.
Thanks, Grace. I'm going to go over to Chris for this one because Chris is currently a captain of his team. Maybe there's something you can share about something that you're doing now or something that you're looking to implement.
Well, I don't think there's anything specifically that I'm looking to implement, but
Yeah.
I've definitely been trying to create an inclusive environment for all my teammates. So that way they view Quizbowl as something that's fun and safe and something that they, look forward to participating in. And I think that when it comes to team cultures, good coaches are an exception, not the rule. And I think it's more on the players to create a good environment for their teammates to want to participate in.
Thanks. I'll go over to Esther. I saw you shaking your head on that one.
Yes, I definitely feel like sometimes in playing Quizbowl, we forget to be like kind to others and treat them with respect. And just as Grace said, I definitely feel like when it comes to retention, how your teammates treat you is extremely important because you spend most of your time like studying and practicing than you do like, let's say, playing tournaments. So if most of that time you're being spent and you feel ostracized and you just feel like, oh, like I can't do this and like my teammates like just suck, then it's gonna turn into something that isn't fun and you're just gonna dread it and lament like practicing and wanting to play Quizbowl, and ultimately a lot of players quit. So I definitely feel like just treating people as equals with respect and also like fostering like a culture and environment that's very welcoming to players.
Thanks, Esther. Let's move on to our next question here. We're going to segue from team culture into misconduct issues, which has been a big thing in Quizbowl over the past several years as they become a little bit more public throughout the community here. But the handling of misconduct issues typically can be a long process and not always satisfactory to the victim of that misconduct. How do you see or experience that misconduct? And are there changes that need to be made in how it's handled? Does it need to be handled quicker? Is there something that needs to be done as far as enabling tournament staff to speak up? Where does that need to start moving? I mean, in what direction does that need to start moving?
I'll start. So I think that we've made a lot of good steps toward being better about reporting misconduct and speaking up about misconduct in more recent years, especially with the creation of the misconduct forum back in, I think, like 2018, which was in my senior year. So that was like a big thing for me back then. I think that while that's a very good step, it's also one step and it's one resource, and that we need more resources for misconduct and how to handle it and report it, because a lot of people don't know what to do. And I think that also not the problem with the misconduct form, but it's just like it can't cover every possible use case. It's maintained by like four very large Quizbowl organizations, but they obviously don't have authority over everything, and they also don't have the context or like the circumstances needed to understand every misconduct case. So there need to be resources at like, you know, the club level and like at tournaments, in larger groups, in regions and things like that, and not just one form that everyone hopes will fix everything. I think one really good step that has been happening recently is that the spread of like codes of conduct for organizations and tournaments. I think that's I'm really happy to see that.
I do want to bring up a quote that I wrote down from our notes from our pre-meet the other day. Grace, you said something that really resonated with me. You said, the misconduct form is national, but misconduct happens at a local level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. You know, I think it's very rare that, you know, that misconduct is not from someone you basically know within your region. And that's why it hurts more. That's why it really is very damaging to your ability to play in this game and to remain in the game. Because while national organizations can mete out consequences, usually weeks after the fact, uh, they don't have the ability to change how people treat you immediately. And so often when we talk about feelings of injustice, about like because of misconduct, when we feel that the consequences of misconduct are not um, proportional to the amount of hurt or the amount of harm they have done, it's because the misconduct is not shut down immediately, or it's that the consequences are a letter sent about 2 weeks later or something to that effect. And so what I would really like to see is for teammates, staffers, coaches, TDs to immediately shut down misconduct when they see it, to rebuke it, to say that this isn't okay, and to give some measure of immediate justice to the victims of misconduct. As part of that, I would like to see treatment of misconduct and basically become almost a routine manner, a routine part of how you run a tournament. So in addition to saying you have 5 seconds on a bonus, I would like TDs to tell all their staffers you are empowered to stop misconduct when you see it. You are empowered to kick players from games if they behave in ways that are disrespectful or actively hurtful. And TDs should also know both how to treat issues of misconduct as they arise in the tournaments and where they need to report those issues of misconduct.
Thanks, Grace. Why don't we move on to our next question here? And we're going to go to a more positive place, I promise you. How have you seen how have you seen Quizbowl, or just people outside of Quizbowl, maybe as an example, who do inclusion right, and how those people made you feel valued and included? And for this one, I'd like to start with Chris.
Yeah, one Quizbowl organization that I've seen that has done inclusion right would have to go with Groger Ranks, and the way that they handled the situation around the Thomas Jefferson High School player, and how they immediately and swiftly, how they immediately and swiftly, excluded those players' stats from their calculations into the rankings. And I think that felt, appropriate to the situation. And I think that's a blueprint for how it should be dealt with in the future.
I'd like to go over to Esther. In our pre-meet, you talked a little bit about, the culture of your team and how your coach runs your team. Can you talk maybe a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I feel very fortunate this year. I play at Valencia College, and our community is quite diverse. So we kind of don't really have like people like, let's say, bullying or like discrimination problems. But one thing that I feel like a tribute to that is how our coach, his name is Chris Borglum, he's very like welcoming, and he makes sure that like everyone feels comfortable, and we make sure to like keep up with each other, and we like talk like outside of Quizbowl. So I definitely think that kind of like camaraderie. Oh my gosh. It definitely does help. And also like from a question aspect, when we're like talking about like, you know, like canonical things and we're getting into knowledge, let's say if there's something like we're talking about like slavery, like he'll point out like, let's say like, oh, like, yeah, like this author's racist, or let's say like he'll point out both like what we need to know and also I guess like the negative standpoints of it. So we definitely do see that whole picture. And I just think it's really such a great way to like make sure that everyone's included.
Thanks, Esther. Oh, Grace,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I'd like to tag on to that in terms of how much a figure of authority in a club can make a difference in terms of making you feel valued and included. As Esther said, Chris is clearly that kind of figure for her club. I've also had a similar kind of experience with Matt Jackson, who was captain of the Yale Quizbowl team when I joined back in 2012 or 2013. Matt, if for those of you who don't know, is one of the great players to ever play this game. And what's more, his personality, Matt lives by the ethical rules that he has set out in a way much more rigorous than I think the rest of us do. The joke was always that Matt lives by the categorical imperative. In other words, if there is a rule that you believe is true for how people should treat each other or how we should morally move through the world, then you absolutely have to hold yourself accountable to those rules. And it's harder than you might think. I know that I at least sometimes when I see, when I hear something that's a little bit uncomfortable, or when I see behavior that's a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not it's harmful, my instinct is often to like sweep it under a rug, put it away, not make a huge deal out of it, not make it awkward and disruptive. But Matt, when he was captain of the team, you could trust him to always shut down any kind of racist joke immediately. He would shut down any kind of sexual jokes as well. And so at the time, I thought that it was, he would say like, we don't do that. And he would basically call people out and hold them accountable for what they were saying, make them listen to what they had in fact said, and ask them basically, is that really what you meant? And what does it mean if that's what you meant? And at the time, I think I thought it was, I thought like, oh, I can handle this. Isn't it a little bit too much? Isn't it a little awkward to always to be so alert to potential injustice in the way people interact around you? But in retrospect, it made me feel incredibly safe, and it made me feel like I could always have someone to turn to, that I always had someone who would support me if I did feel uncomfortable, and who would make sure that that discomfort would stop. And I wish that everyone had an advocate like that.
Thank you, Grace. Now that we've finished that, let's move on to our next question. We're going to talk about bigger ideas for the next few questions here, about where we think maybe the game is going and what people can start doing. I know that that's sort of the crux of a lot of the questions that are in the chat right now. So maybe we'll end up answering your chat or your chat question over the next few that we're going to be talking about here. But the next question I have for you all is, how have you seen change? How have you seen positive change in the Quizbowl community, and where do you think that we're going from here? Where do you envision this game, a year from now or 5 years from now? And I'll start with Caroline on this one.
Yeah, so I previously mentioned that I appreciate the creation of resources like the Misconduct Forum and the Codes of Conduct. I think those are positive steps. I think that as a community, we've started to talk a lot more about issues of like misconduct and diversity. Like, for example, in the Misconduct and Misogyny channel on Discord, I think we have a way to go there on how to have productive conversations, but I think it's good that we've started valuing these things. Another thing I wanted to mention is that, especially as someone who's really concerned with question writing, is that I'm glad that we seem to have started prioritizing diversity in question content more, and also it's become more common to have open calls for writers, because I think that any measure that necessarily excludes minority people by, any measure that's necessarily exclusive, like for example, like sets that are only writing tasks where people all know each other will disproportionately affect people who are minorities because they're already excluded by default. So it's sort of exacerbating that problem even if you don't necessarily intend to be excluding them specifically. So I'm glad that the community has started to be more inclusive in more general ways over the years, even if they're not specifically targeted toward being inclusive of people of color, because I think those will help people of color more.
One of the things that I do want to bring up, and I'd like for him to talk a little bit more about this. Chris in our pre-meet talked a little bit about how he feels the online tournaments have changed sort of the face of Quizbowl. Chris, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for me, the biggest change that I've seen is the shift to online tournaments this year due to the COVID pandemic. And I think, for me at least, they've made the game more accessible to different teams. I've faced teams from a couple miles away that I never even knew had a Quizbowl team this year because the game was more accessible to them in an online format. And I think whatever role online tournaments have going forward, their ability to bring new teams to Quizbowl should definitely be taken note of.
Very important. Thank you, Chris. We'll move on to our next question here, and we're going to start with Esther on this one. What advice would you give your younger self on how to navigate issues of diversity and inclusion in Quizbowl?
So an advice that I would give to my younger self is to not to pigeonhole yourself into topics that other people believe that you should be studying because it just fits with your character. I would say study what it is that you love and that you want to learn more about, because that's ultimately going to make the game more enjoying for you and it's going to make you want to continue play it. And I would also say, like, don't tolerate like any like disrespect towards you and towards other players, and you should definitely stand up for yourself and others because it just makes the game a lot more respectable. And I just feel like personally you're able to like feel better like sleeping at night when you stick up for yourself and for others that may be facing discrimination.
Thanks. And I think we'll ask everyone for an answer on this. I'll move on to Grace. What advice would you give your younger self?
I would say that Quizbowl should be joyful. I remember when I started playing, the Quizbowl really was all joy. It was finding out that there was so much more in the world than I knew even existed before. It was all of a sudden feeling like I had an entry into this great conversation that had been going on for thousands of years, that I just, all of a sudden I was around people who were so interested in Renaissance art, who could tell the difference between a Correggio and like, I don't know, some other kind of, who, or like an Andrea del Sarto painting, who were just so interested in the world. And I would say that if I could go back and tell my younger self, anything, it would be to try to hold on to that joy and no matter what happens. And also to try to make sure that that joy is kept alive for other people on your team as well. I've talked about this a lot with Olivia Murton, who's on the organizing panel here, but there's no problem in Quizbowl that isn't present in the world at large. But the difference between Quizbowl and the world at large is that we actually have so much more power because it's a smaller community, because it's a community that's run very much by the players. And as a result, don't be afraid to stand up, as Esther said, for other players. Don't be afraid to use the voice and any clout that you've accumulated in the community to amplify the voices of other people of color and women. Don't be afraid to speak up when you see something wrong, because here, as opposed to the rest of the world, you don't have to compromise, and you don't have to compromise yourself, at least. And what you say matters so much more. So live up to that.
Thanks, Grace. We'll move on to Caroline. One piece of advice you'd give to your younger self.
Yeah, I think I would tell my younger self that it's okay to step back when I need to, because I think my younger self tended to get very invested in this game. And often she just felt like the need to prove herself. She felt very strongly on a lot of issues that weren't always the most psychologically healthy. And like I'm proud of the things I've done, but I also wish that I like could have like taken some more breaks and known when it was like time to stop and not worry so much about like the validation I get from this game. Yeah.
And Chris is the youngest member of our panel. What advice would you give to your not so younger self?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what the other panelists have said, I would say be confident, speak up, voice your concerns. So that way they can be addressed by the appropriate outlets. And who knows, they may even get talked about a panel.
Thanks, everyone. This is the last question of our formal agenda here. It's kind of the biggest one. So I don't want you to feel any pressure in coming up with a big answer here, because we're all understanding here that it is not the responsibility of this panel to solve every problem regarding race and inclusion. But what's one step that you'd like to see the community take towards being better about dealing with issues of race and inclusion? And, you know, even if you don't have an answer to that, what's one small thing that what's one small step that people in this community can start taking now to move us in the right direction? I'll start with Esther on this one.
So I definitely believe this is a hard hitter, and I don't think there's one silver bullet that'll solve it all, but I feel like it'll be multiple. But I would say one step would to be definitely like educate yourself on any bias that you have so you can be aware of when it's present, and also like keeping in mind of those that are marginalized and making sure that they feel included and amplifying their voices. Because I feel a lot of times when we feel like so socially aware and like we have just like the spirit of social justice, we forget that who we're talking about is humans, and we forget to like treat them as such, and we kind of just like, even though we want to do good, it may also end up doing harm in the good that we're trying to do. So I would definitely say to make sure that you amplify those that you want to help.
So we'll move on to Chris. What's one thing?
I would say self-reflection. Just look and see what change you want to see in Quizbowl, and no matter how big or small it be, take steps to create that change.
Awesome. And Caroline?
I would say learn not to enable others. There are many people in Quizbowl who have committed misconduct or some form or another, which is terrible, but there are many, many more people who have said nothing when that misconduct happened, or they know it, but they don't tell others, or they just assume everyone knows it, but no one does anything about it. So try to be that person who does something about it, even if you're afraid to do it because everyone else is saying nothing.
Thanks, Caroline. And we will end with Grace.
I think very often the kinds of solutions we think of, again, because the experience of Quizbowl is so locally determined, are ones that individuals can do. But in terms of what organizations can do, I know that Quizbowl, like especially the economics of Quizbowl, have their own limitations. But I would say make real efforts and dedicate real funds to outreach in communities, either geographically or economically or racially distinct from the ones that we've traditionally associated with the game. And make sure that when you make those outreach efforts, that you're also giving those teams the possibility of really succeeding. So give them the resources they need, and maybe bring the game to them if at all possible.
Thank you, Grace. Now we reach the part of our agenda where we're going to be taking questions. We're going to start with some of the questions that came in through the chat over the past few weeks, and then we'll move on to questions in the Zoom chat. So you still have several minutes here to add questions to the Zoom chat if you'd like. And if there are ones in there that we haven't answered through this set we have, we'll get to those right after. So let's start with this one that I see right here. Why do you think, are there so few players and coaches of color in Quizbowl? It's kind of a broad question that has a lot of different answers. But maybe one of you can offer, maybe some of you can offer, maybe one reason why you think there are so few coaches and players of color in Quizbowl today.
So I'll take a stab at it. I would say one thing that I can that comes to mind is just the fact that there's so many, like, at least from what I've seen, there's a lot of coaches that used to be players. So I would say that already, if there's since there's a limited players of color, so you're naturally, if the retention rate is low, then you're not going to have as many coaches of color. And I mean, I'm not a coach, and I've haven't personally spoken to coaches, but I would like to see if maybe amongst other coaches in different schools, have they ever faced mistreatment against coaches of different schools, especially if they may be in a region that isn't typically known for Quizbowl and they're kind of starting up a new team.
Thanks, Esther. Caroline?
Yeah, I feel like we didn't get to talk as much about the topic of class as much as we could have, but I just anecdotally, when I was in high school, I went to a very, very rich private high school, and it was in Asia, so obviously I was surrounded by Asians who are people of color. So I didn't have, in high school, I didn't have a problem with being surrounded with people of color as very much. And the reason Quizbowl was more accessible to us than maybe people of color in the US is because, again, my high school was a very rich private school. I think I went to 2 HNCTs and I spent $2,000 myself on going there. And that was just the kind of thing families at my high school could afford, to just drop $1,000 on a tournament each year. And more on regular season tournaments. And I think that's a big part of why Quizbowl tends to be less accessible, because there's kind of just there's often the implicit belief that you have money, you have interest in what Grace kind of mentioned are sort of highbrow interests. You have access to resources, you have good internet nowadays, you have transportation and things like that.
Thanks, panel. Let's move on to our next question here. What is the best way to offer myself as an ally as a white person?
In many ways, allyship, although it takes up more of the conversation sometimes than it should, is one of the best ways to help people of color stay in the game. By which I mean, if you do stand up for people of color, and really make efforts to be intentional in how you write, be intentional in who you invite to play on your team, especially for more open team formation setups, as you sometimes see in the post-collegiate circuit. If you are really intentional about who you invite to your tournaments, all of these things are important ways of making the experience for people of color better in Quizbowl.
I'll take a second and add to that really quickly. Being an ally as a white person, I think there's a lot of things that you can do just on the surface. The panelists brought up a lot of different things, a lot of different suggestions of things that you can do as far as improving your team culture and being more inclusive. I think one of the biggest things that we sometimes leave off is you have to be an ally when nobody is looking. It's very, very important that when you're at a tournament or when you're at a practice, it shouldn't take the fact that somebody made a Black joke that's inappropriate and you have a Black teammate right there for you to speak up. It's much more powerful when you can speak up when nobody else is looking. It's like that old adage, your character is how you act when nobody's looking. I think the same way applies here, because a lot of these things do happen behind closed doors, behind closed hotel rooms, in side practices where people are just kind of casually talking with friends. Being able to call those things out when you see them, regardless of who is there, I think does so much as far as changing the culture of a team and helping people to feel more included. And it should be something that you should be practicing even without having people of color on your team or women on your team. That should just be something that you should be practicing every single day. Anybody else want to add to that, or should we move on? Let's move on. Let's move on to this question. Besides reacting to, and we sort of answered this one, besides reacting to inappropriate situations, do you have recommendations of what coaches can do to make their practices and teams more supportive of diversity and inclusion?
I think that it can start from who you think about when you try to recruit players to your team. Again, a good coach is an absolute treasure, and one that I think most teams aren't lucky enough to have. So one thing can start with, often if you're coaching at a magnet school, especially a magnet school where students are tracked differently, either tracked into high performing classes versus not, don't assume that the characteristics that we associate with Quizbowlers, intellectual curiosity, and openness to the world, don't assume that those characteristics belong to students in honors classes, or these are characteristics you can find in students of all quote unquote levels of academic performance. So be less restrictive in how you recruit students. Don't make assumptions about who would be interested in the team. Really cast a wide net. And I would say if you see someone who might be good at the game, especially I think women and people of color need to know that there's someone who really believes in them and believes in their potential. So I would say it's an amazingly powerful thing is to say, I think that you could be good at this game, and give them all the resources that they need to get started and become more deeply embedded in the community.
I'll add on. Oh, Caroline, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I think that two things. So the first is, I think coaches need to remember to work on cultivating a friendly and inclusive team culture, and that means not just focusing on being the best at Quizbowl and making sure that your players are the best at playing Quizbowl that they could possibly be, because there is so much more to this game and this community than just how many points you're scoring. And if you try to instill the value of caring about their points most of the time, that can lead to really unhealthy attitudes, like the cult of PPG. I see someone alludes to in the Q&A. The other thing I want coaches to consider is that they often just don't know what's really going on, behind the scenes, so to speak, because a lot you don't know what kids say when you're not around, and they will wait when you're not around to say really nasty things to each other, especially online in their group chats and their Discord servers. It's easy to just form really bad group chat cultures, and coaches will never know about it. It was very common in my high school experience. So just be worried and know that just because you don't see, if you think your kids are all seem to all be fine on the surface, if one of them comes to you saying that's not the case, then you should consider that it's not the case, even if it doesn't seem like it.
Thanks, Caroline. And I'll just add one quick thing here. Oftentimes, and I remember this was the case when I was in high school many moons ago, when we started practice at the beginning of the year, we had 8 to 12 students at all times, and I think our coach just kind of automatically assumed, I've got my team right here. These are the people that showed up to the first practice. I think there's sometimes an incorrect assumption that's made that just because you have a full team show up to your first few practices, that's actually the best team that you can put forth. Just because people are there doesn't mean that there aren't other talented players that you could be recruiting. And as a coach, my recommendation to you would be to encourage players to bring people to practice during those first few practices, because it's really important for you to not just to get the word out about a Quizbowl, but just to have a different set of minds in the room. I think the more brains you have in that room, the better off you are in building a solid team that actually works well together, and not just, hey, here's 4 very aggressive here's 4 people who are very aggressive on the buzzer who have high PPGs. That's not necessarily the best team that you can put out. one of the other things that we did in college that was part of our sort of qualification, I played on the Honda Campus All-Star Challenge circuit in college. And one of the things that I think really helped to help us build a better team was we held campus tournaments at our schools to help build the best, for our coaches to help build the best possible teams. So, just having a tournament on lower level questions to get people into the game, to get people to come to practices and really see what you have to offer, and then helping you to build a better team at the end of the day. I know that was the case for us, where it really helped us. So let's move on to our next question here. Diversity in Quizbowl seems to decrease in later career stages. What can we do to maintain diversity as careers progress from high school to college, then possibly to staff?
I think as someone who has undergone a lot of those career transitions, there are lots of reasons why someone might leave Quizbowl. Almost all of, in fact, all of which are legitimate, right? But I would say that I could think about Quizbowl as almost a tent, and the core tent pole holding up the very center of the tent is the game itself. Do you enjoy the game? Do you enjoy the way it, the perspective the game gives on the world? But the other things holding down the tent, you can see that I haven't actually built very many tents in my life, but the individual pegs holding down the sides of this tent are actually the friendships and the relationships that you make. And what can be difficult, I think it's difficult for everyone as you move from one stage to another, but it might be particularly important for people of color and for women where their team environment and having a good team environment in one location, it's in no way a given that in the next place you go, the team environment will be as welcoming. And so in some ways, it's, those friendships at each step and relationships that you have with the community, at each step, they're holding you to the game. And when you move to a new place, if you move to a new place with no teammates in common, or you're not sure that you like the culture of the new team, or even you're just not very plugged into the larger community, it becomes harder to set down new roots. It becomes harder to decide, okay, should I try to build relationships here again? Or are there other things in my life that I could be doing besides Quizbowl? I think one thing that can be difficult for players of color, especially because they tend to take on so much responsibility, both in terms of getting shunted into service roles and also because of the pressures they put on themselves, is that Quizbowl can stop being fun after a while and starts being work. And so at each transition in your life, you get to take a look again and say, is this really something I want to continue doing? And the more that Quizbowl is work, and the less tight your connections are with the community as a whole, the more you can say, all right, I'm done with this. That central pillar of, just the game itself is not enough.
Thanks, Grace. Does anybody want to add on to that? Okay, let's move on. We actually are done with our Google submitted questions, so we can move on to the questions here in our Zoom chat. So I've been looking through these to find some good ones for you. And I just lost the one that I had. Oh, there it is. Regarding the pursuit of validation that we talked about early on in this conversation, over time, did you obtain that validation? Did you not obtain it? Or did you just stop pursuing it?
So I would say for me, it was kind of like a 50-50. So when you study more, you definitely do get recognized more as a player, because they just see someone who has a high PPG and it's okay, this person knows stuff. But I would definitely say that at some point it kind of reaches its peak of how much respect you can attain, and then from there that validation isn't enough, because it feels great to be recognized for being a good player, but I feel the validation of people seeing you as a human being and as a person and as someone that should be on the team and as they want on the team is worth a lot more. And I feel that's something that we as humans, that's what we want and that's what we crave. So the validation from studying hard and racking up points is great, but it doesn't equal, and it's so small compared to people seeing you and acknowledging you for who you are as a person, not just how many points did I score in this tournament.
Anybody else?
I want to add that I think I get a lot of internal validation nowadays from Quizbowl, like the kind of validation you get from like getting good at a new category or just like learning something really cool or something like that. But I've mostly tried to stop seeking external validation. I think something that like minorities often need to understand is that sometimes people will just not respect you no matter what because of a mark on their own character, not because of your own shortcomings. And no matter like how many points you rack up, they still won't necessarily respect you. And again, that's their fault and it's not yours, and you can't attribute that to yourself. And I think especially in high school, it was just like very common for me to like as soon as I got any validation from like doing better, I would start moving the goalposts because I would find that that I would get some respect, but I wouldn't get as much as I deserved, or that like people would still be like crediting my second score more than me, or that people would say that like other player is still better. So it just felt like an endless loop where I had to keep getting better, and that's not healthy for you.
Chris or Grace?
Yeah, I personally stopped pursuing external validation, and because I found that I was pursuing it for the wrong reasons. I found that I was trying to break stereotypes, and I wanted to prove that, people of color could, be good and exceed in Quizbowl. So, kind of like Caroline said, I definitely have sought to, prove my own expectations of myself and seek internal validation.
I agree with what everyone has said about, but I also think that for those of us who, I think as I've grown up a little bit more, I need the external validation less. But at the same time, it's really nice to be recognized. It's really nice for someone to see what you're doing and say, yeah, you're fucking kicking butt. Oops, I shouldn't have cursed. And so this is actually a place where, not to reify the existing hierarchies based on PPG and so on in Quizbowl, but it's really great for someone who is really recognized for their play to say, oh yeah, and by the way, Grace got this amazing buzz or something to that effect. It's really nice to be recognized nonetheless. So while I think it's great to need it less, in fact, I think absolutely essential for your mental health and like your sense of self to need it less, it's also one of the ways in which, you can feel seen in the community is for someone else to actually see you and to see what you're doing. So don't be shy about pointing out the accomplishments of even people who aren't your close friends when you're really impressed.
And Grace has used our one allowed swear for today's panel. So none of the rest of you do, otherwise we'll get fined. Let's move on to this question. What would you like to see from moderators or staff in a tournament environment to make you feel supported and included? Are there specific things you've seen in this regard that you appreciate, or conversely behaviors that didn't help or actively diminished your experience?
So I would say moderators that definitely call out like inappropriate behavior like as soon as it happens, even if like let's say it feels uncomfortable. And I would also say like this doesn't have to deal with like inequality or like racial inclusion, but I would say that I definitely love it when like a moderator like stands up for themselves. Like if there's like a player that's like during bonuses just like interrupting, like answering like as the moderator speaking, I love it when they're just like, please let me finish the bonus before you answer. So I definitely just say like calling out things that just are inappropriate towards the game that just makes it less fun is what I love seeing from a moderator.
I agree with that. I especially appreciate a moderator who is willing to call out behavior, like even when no one else is willing to do so. One of the things I remember the most from high school is I was playing in the finals of a tournament, and I was the only girl playing in the finals out of 8 people. And the other team had this bonus that was like named this it was like name this property or something, like name this characteristic, and the team answered being male, and the answer was like owning property, and the other team said, isn't that the same thing? And it felt like really terrible because I was the only girl there, and there were maybe like 5 girls in the whole auditorium, and they were all watching and they laughed about it. And I just like I often think about how I wish a moderator had said something about at that time, even though I think even myself as a moderator would have had a hard time saying to stop that in an auditorium of like 90 people.
Thanks, Caroline. By the way, everyone who's been asking questions in the chat, these have, or in the Q&A rather, you all have very, very good questions. Some of them are more institutionally based, and so I'm not sure if the panel necessarily has answers to some of those, but some of you have questions that relate specifically to your team. So I want to get to one of these. Could you elaborate on possible ways? Oh, not that one. Oh, I will get to that one. Sorry. I just missed it. Okay, here we go. It sounds like somebody who's currently on a team. Hi, do you have tips on how to try to fix the community at your club, even if the coach is oblivious and doesn't care much? My club has a rampant problem of misogyny, and others and I have reached out to the coach many times, but the coach really didn't seem to care and said he couldn't do much. How can I navigate trying to make club members realize how hurtful misogyny is without needing the coach to intervene?
I kind of want to take what Grace said about the about like when someone says something inappropriate, asking them like, is that what you meant? And like, if so, what does that mean? I think that's such a great strategy. As soon as you said it, I was like, that's amazing. And I would say, like, I know like some coaches can just be warm bodies, so it's kind of hard to like get them to do anything, but definitely like taking it upon yourself to stand up for what you believe in and what you think is right and setting that example. And you never know, others may follow suit, because there could be people sitting there and they see that like something like what's being done is wrong, but they don't necessarily like feel like empowered or emboldened to kind of like stand up and like say it's wrong. So if you kind of like start that, you could potentially start like a chain reaction on your team.
Thanks, Esther. Why don't we move on to our next question here? What do you do as people of color and women on those days when you think Quizbowl is irredeemable and just want to quit and let it all burn? How do you stay hopeful?
I think wow, I feel that one. But at the same time, I would say that having been in this game, goodness knows, forever, having taken steps back at times when it did feel overwhelming or it didn't feel like where I wanted to be at the time, I think Quizbowl really has become so much more welcoming community over even just the time I've been in Quizbowl, or even over the last 5 years. I know it's not enough. I know it's not happening soon enough. And I know that, you can't rest um, until large-scale changes really are enacted everywhere. But at the same time, things have already improved so much between the misconduct form, between changes, I think, in community norms about how people communicate with each other, and also the growing use of codes of conduct, the growing at least expectation for how people should treat each other. These are all things that didn't just happen. They happened because someone pointed out that this behavior isn't okay. And yes, it does feel like whack-a-mole. I don't think it's satisfying necessarily to look at, cases of misogyny or cases of racism and then try to like deal with them one by one. It doesn't solve the entire problem. And it certainly doesn't solve the structural issue, but each mole that is whacked, as it were, does make the experience of Quizbowl better for someone. And I think that the overall tide of the community, the overall emphasis on increasing inclusion in question writing, all of these are things, even the existence of this panel are things that I could not have imagined when I first began playing Quizbowl. And they didn't just happen, they happened because people worked at it. It's hard to continue working on it. You can stop when it's not healthy for you, but I really, really believe that things are getting better.
I'll piggyback on that. Thank you, Grace. As somebody who's been in Quizbowl now for just a little over 15 years, wow, does that sound daunting? having seen the changes in how tournaments are run and the diversity has been staggering. I remember back when I was a player, and I remember just going to tournaments and seeing, you know, a sea of white guys. You know, you'd see maybe one or two other Black people at these tournaments, and they're often in the background, you know, rarely ever seen or heard from. You know, their teams didn't really interact with them. I remember days when, you know, women were female players were treated more like tournament moms, where, you know, they bring along the snacks and carry coats and things that no other player would, you know, should ever have to do. You know, and a coach is standing right there, and, you know, your lone female player is, you know, is carrying a snack box for your team. To now where, you know, you see such, you know, you see diversity amongst gender, you see more diversity amongst people of color at these tournaments. And, you know, that didn't happen overnight. And so for somebody who feels, you know, who doesn't always feel like the game is for them, and maybe feels like, you know, hey, I need to step away from this really, you know, doesn't concern me anymore. Like Grace said, you have to pick your spots. And when you need to take a break. But I truly do believe that over time, the game is going to continue to get better with things like this, with conversations like this, tough conversations that have to happen, assuming that we stick to this and you know, come up with real solutions that people can actually adopt at their clubs, at their tournaments. I think that this game is going to continue to get better. Why don't we move on to our next question here? Oh, okay. I am a white male coach at a wealthy majority white private high school, and I haven't been able to recruit and retain players of color. And when I do, I feel like I'm asking them to join an existing culture. For example, here's how we practice. Here's how we get pumped for games. Here's how we interact as a team. Do you have any advice for coaches as far as changes we can make to make the environment more inclusive? For the most part, new players don't stick around enough to impact the existing culture. I'm going to start with this one, and I don't mean to say this to be, you know, to be harsh or anything, but you have an existing culture, and if players aren't sticking around long enough to impact the existing culture, then maybe there's just something wrong at a base level with the culture. And that's not something that I would say is a reflection of you. It's just, hey, maybe this is just the way things have always been done. Your team has been successful for many years, possibly, and that's just how you guys roll. I'd say just try different things and be open to, you know, be open to trying different things at practice, or maybe holding. I know some schools host 2 separate practices, one for your existing team and one for your new players, to get them acclimated so that you can start building a culture amongst your entire team. But I'll throw it over to our panelists to see if there's anything else that they'd like to add.
So I would say, as a person of color, when you kind of like join a new team, it kind of feels like conform or die. So it's like I either conform to what everyone's doing, and like I just like either like I like it and I just fit in, or like I don't really like it, but I kind of just like grit my teeth and I deal with it, or I just like stop playing Quizbowl. But I would say one thing that you can do that I like, it's been done on me, is kind of like including them in the conversation, or like making decisions. And it can be little things. I know that at Valencia, at some of our first practices, like our coach would ask us, okay, we have to make teams. And he'll be like, okay, Esther, like make the teams for us. Or he'll ask other players to do it. And it kind of just like includes them in the conversation, and it asks them like what it is that you want to do and how do you want to like hold practice. And even though like it's something little, it meant a lot to me, because I was like, oh, like this is like fun. Like I like these people here. I want to continue playing on this team. So I don't like have any big ideas, but that definitely did work for me.
Thanks, Esther. Let's move on to our next question. I think we have time for a couple more here. What advice do you have on dealing with cult of PPG? It seems like people at my club who have higher PPGs get away with anything because they're essential to the success of the team, even if they make other members of the team feel like crap.
Okay, I really resonate with that question as well. I think one thing to remember and impress upon other people is that that Quizbowl isn't necessarily just about like a single person scoring as many points as possible. It's a team game. You should be working with your teammates. It's not just like, not everything should be revolving around one person, and you'll probably find yourself a more effective team if you do that anyway. But possible game benefits aside, I think it's also just like that's also just like a general club culture problem, and a very common one that, and I don't quite know how to solve it really, but I think it's a little bit missing the point of Quizbowl, and that Quizbowl isn't just about scoring the most points, it's a game of knowledge.
Thanks, Caroline. Let's do a couple more here. Do you think that the intellectual diversity offered by women and people of color contributes significantly in bonuses where we don't quantify or measure individuals' contributions? And if so, how can we make this more visible and praiseworthy? And I think, Grace, you spoke to this a little bit earlier, just with your declaration that, hey, it's good for people to feel, like they've contributed something to the team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it can be done in a good way. It can be done in a condescending way, as with all efforts at inclusion, right? But I think when done right, to always look for that second opinion, even on bonuses that you're pretty sure about, or to say, in your post-tournament remarks, to an email summarizing, how the tournament went. Amazing pull on a hard part by a team member X, Y, or Z. I think having some kind of moment of recognition where you talk about a glorious moment for everybody on the team, makes visible some of the things that don't get recorded in statistics, like knowledge in bonuses, and or even contributions that aren't immediately quantifiable in terms of gameplay, but matter a lot for team culture.
Thanks, Grace. And we'll take this one last question here. If you've asked a question we haven't gotten to it, don't worry. We're taking note of all the questions that were asked today, and we'll make sure to get answers to your questions, or we'll answer them at a future panel. So don't worry, we will get to you for sure. But I'll do this last one for our panel here today, and I'll pose this to everybody. So I'd like for everybody to answer this one. For the panel, are you generally optimistic about the direction that inclusion and response to misconduct is taking in the Quizbowl community, or do you have reservations about certain issues?
I'm definitely optimistic because I've seen the effort that Quizbowl organizations have, taken to put forth this panel. So that definitely instills me with optimism and hope because they're at least putting forth an effort and trying to better the situation.
I agree with that. I think we're going in a good direction. I think the worst thing I'm afraid of is just that we will stop at some point. Like people will go, okay, we've done enough. And I don't think we're anywhere near the point where we have done enough. But I think the general direction is a good thing. Yeah, Chris also brought up, and I agree with that. I think I'm really glad that people propose this panel, and that people want to have discussions like this. I hope that, especially after this panel, that it doesn't stop and people will take our suggestions to heart.
And I think one thing, in line with what both Chris and Caroline said about continuing this conversation, one of the ways in which I think that working on issues of inclusion and equity in the communication can be exhausting is because you feel like you're working alone, and you know how important it is, but you're not getting that kind of feedback. You're not, we talked about feeling seen in terms of your contributions in Quizbowl, but in your terms of your contributions to the community, and in terms of feeling like you're really moving the conversation, that's so important too. So please, even if you're not sure, no one needs to have all the right opinions. God knows I don't, but be a part of the conversation, talk about these things with your own team. I think, there are all these institutional things we can do to make Quizbowl better, but it also just comes down to how much you try to make inclusion just a part of how you see Quizbowl and how you see your own part in Quizbowl. So I would love to see more people participate in this post-panel discussion. It's important, of course, to do this right, blah, 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 to make sure that you're not swamping out the voices of, women of color and, people of color. But let us know you're listening. Please contribute to the conversation. It's hard to feel like you're speaking into a vacuum. And change comes when more people are active and they feel like it's their struggle too.
And Esther, I'll give you the last word.
Well, honestly, I feel like Grace and everyone else put it perfectly. I definitely feel like Quizbowl is a community, and how we choose to handle like misconduct should be a social issue. So everyone should be speaking about it, whether like you were like harmed, like whether it personally affected you or whether it didn't, because it definitely is like if you are the one that is like personally like attacked by it, it feels like you're ostracized and kind of like you're hindering the game, because like now everyone has to like stop what they're doing and like deal with how you feel and what happened to you, and you can kind of like internalize that. But when you see others like speak up for you and say, yeah, like I saw that isn't okay, and there's more of a conversation about it, and it's seen in the community that this is intolerable, it feels more like a group effort, and it makes the transition into like going back into like playing Quizbowl and when things are fun a lot easier than seeing this as like something really abrasive that we kind of have to handle. And it is definitely a hard and heavy topic to talk about it, but once we get past that, I definitely do see that it'll be a lot easier, and Quizbowl can be fun for everyone. So
And that's where we'll end it. Panel, you have been stellar this afternoon. So thank you all so much. I think that this conversation is going to make a lot of people think. And I think that I'm hoping that it results in action by these wonderful organizations that have put this together today, and everybody just taking part. Whether you are running an organization or whether you're a first-time player, everybody can play a role in helping us get to a better point here. And I'm really, really hoping that in the coming days, weeks, months, and years that all of you decide to lend a helping hand here. So thank you for that. A big hand to today's panel. Again, you guys were all great, or you all were great. I'm trying to get guys for everybody out of my vocabulary.
And
it's
also,
coming day by day.
Also, a huge hand for Jeremy, our amazing moderator.
Thank you. Thank you. So just a couple notes for you. So you can submit a feedback on this panel if you'd like to add anything else to this panel. Submit your feedback at the question solicitation link. Olivia is about to link to that in the chat right now. So click on that link if you have any additional feedback that you'd like to offer, because we definitely would like to do something like this again, possibly a follow-up. And this conversation is going to continue on Discord under the hashtag panel discussion. Again, go into the Discord. If you don't see it there, make sure to message Olivia. She's Olivia M on Discord, and she'll get you access to that panel. Again, thank you, everybody. We hope that you have an amazing rest of your weekend, and we'll definitely be talking soon.